What a great song. We will stand as children of the promise. We'll walk by faith and not by sight. And this is really, I think, what we're getting at this morning in the sermon, that we are somehow connected to the story of God all the way back in Genesis. All the way back in Genesis, we read the story of Abraham, of Isaac, of Jacob. We understand that we are still a part of the story today. And what happens with them and their faith and their moments of decision, it's the same for us today. And we are called to either stand in the promise or, as we find out today, to despise the promise, as Esau did. We've been studying together in the book of Genesis over the last several weeks. Actually, since the week after Easter, we've been in Genesis. But particularly in recent weeks, we've been in the story of Abraham and his family. And you remember Abraham was called by God to step out in faith, to go to a place. It didn't make sense for him to go there with a wife who couldn't have kids, in a land full of pagan people. And God said to him, I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'm going to bless the whole world through you and your descendants. And in time, God proved to be faithful, giving a son to an old woman, an old barren woman. And in time, you remember last week, Abraham grew old, and his son Isaac, by the time he's 40, he's still not married. You know, still laying at home watching the TV too often or something, I don't know. But he's not married, and Abraham's worried about this, so he says, I don't want him to find a Canaanite wife. And so he sends a servant over to his homeland to find a wife. And Rebekah dramatically and miraculously leaves her homeland and joins Abraham's servant and travels back and marries Isaac. And that's kind of where our story picks up today. Now, this morning, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 25, and in the first few sentences of chapter 25, we have kind of a historical account, if you will, and then in 19, we pick up with the story of Isaac. But before we do that, let me share with you an illustration. In 2006, a guy named David Brooks reported in the New York Times that kids who wait for something do better in school. And he is speaking of a 1970 experiment by Walter Mischel with 4-year-olds. And this is what he did. He put a marshmallow and a bell in the room. And he told the kid, okay, look, if you ring the bell, I will come back and you can eat the marshmallow, okay? Or if you wait and I come back on my own, you'll get 2 marshmallows, okay? And so they took videos all the way back in the 1970. They took videos, and some of the kids were squirming and kicking and hiding their eyes, desperately trying to exercise self-control. The performance of the kids varied widely. Some broke down and rang the bell within 1 minute. Others waited as long as 15 minutes. But children, now again, when was this? This was in 1970, so there's been some 40 years of observation. And by 2006, they had observed that those children who waited longer had higher SAT scores. They got into better colleges. And on average, they achieved more as adults. The children who rang the bell the quickest were more likely to become bullies. They received lower teacher and parental evaluations 10 years later and were more likely to have drug problems. Now today, the story is kind of like that. Esau fails to wait, but it's more than that. But before we dive into the story again, let's get to just a little bit of background before we get into that this morning. Now again, you remember the story? I've already kind of recounted a little bit this morning of Abraham finding the wife for Isaac, Rebekah. And again, they're married. At the end of chapter 24, Sarah dies. And then we get to chapter 25. And again, the first 18 verses are fairly historical here. We're not going to read every verse here, but I do want you to know kind of what's in that because it helps us understand when we pick up in verse 19 with the story of Isaac. You remember, Abraham has several children, and you might not remember this, but in verse 25, I didn't mean to throw that up. In verse 25, you read verse 1 of chapter 25, Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. Now, if we had like Trivial Pursuit this morning and I said, what was Abraham's second wife's name? How many of you would get that right? Probably nobody, right? You know, what is all this about? Another wife? When did this happen, right? Well, we read in the end of chapter 24 that Sarah died, and some scholars believe that after Sarah's death, Abraham takes another wife. Some scholars believe that even Abraham took this wife before Sarah died, and this would not have been uncommon in this culture because many times men take second wives or maids or concubines, and if you look at Keturah's children that are described in the first few verses there, it seems likely that Keturah would have been a maidservant or a concubine, the way in which her children are treated. But we get this list of the children's names in verses 2 through 3 there. Verse 4, you read all these were descendants of Keturah. And then we read in verse 5, Abraham left everything he owned to Isaac. But while he was still living, he gave gifts to the sons of his concubines and sent them away from his son Isaac to the land of the east. So that kind of gives us a clue there that maybe she was one of the concubines. But Abraham gives them gifts and he sends them away because they are not the promised one. Isaac is the promised one. And then in verse 7 you read of Abraham's death. Altogether Abraham lived 175 years. Then Abraham breathed his last and died at a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Then in verse 12 through 18, you read the story of Ishmael. We covered that. David preached on that at the end of June. Ishmael is Abraham's son, in verse 12 there, whom Sarah's maidservant, Hagar the Egyptian, bore to Abraham. And so we know the story of that. Ishmael becomes the father of the Arab people. And here we see the account of Ishmael, and again, he goes off to a different place. The ESV Study Bible points out that this section here on Ishmael confirms God's promise made to Ishmael in chapter 17. You see that kind of unpacked here in 25. And then by the time you get to verse 19, you see this is the account of Abraham's son Isaac. Now again, this is the one in which the promise is going to be fulfilled. This is the one that God promised to the couple, the old barren couple, and he was born to them, and he is the child of the promise. This is the one that Abraham took up onto the mountain in obedience to God and nearly sacrificed. This is the one, Isaac. We are landing kind of on his story this morning. I kind of picture these first 18 verses of chapter 25 like if you were watching this as a movie. You ever watch a movie and you're kind of landing on one scene, but in the background you see a collage of different things happening? That's kind of what it seems like is happening here. We're getting Keturah and her children going over here, Ishmael going over here. And the scene focuses down on Isaac, and this is where our story picks up today. Now, we're going to do something a little bit different than reading the text this morning. I'm going to ask my family, or part of my family, to come this morning, and we're going to do a dramatic reading. And we're not drama people, so you'll have to excuse us in this. At least I'm not. Is Kendra here? Yes, Kendra. All right, Matt's got everybody set up here. I don't need one, but...
Oh, well then, here, Levi, this is for you. I'll take this one.
All right, you guys stand down here.
I'll figure it out.
We'll let...
Matt's got it on, I'm sure. They're on and ready right now.
Wait, where did they go? Oh, I gave you the wrong one. Trade one more time.
They're on and ready.
They're on and ready.
Thank you.
All right, you guys over here.
We're caught up on the next step then. That's
These are the descendants of Isaac, Abram's son. Abram was the father of Isaac.
Isaac was 40 years old when he married.
Rebecca.
daughter of Bethuel, the Aramean of Padan Aram, sister of Laban the Aramean.
Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer.
And his wife Rebekah conceived. The children struggled within her, and she said, "If it is to be this way, why do I live?" So she went to inquire of the Lord.
And the Lord said to her, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples born of you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the elder shall serve the younger.
When her time to give birth was at hand, there were twins in her womb.
The first came out red, all his body like a hairy mantle, so they named him Esau.
After the
Just don't hold it so close. It's okay.
After the brothers came out with his hand gripping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob.
Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah bore them.
When the boys grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field,
While Jacob was a quiet man living in tents.
Isaac loved Esau because he was fond of game.
But Rebekah loved Jacob.
Once, when Jacob was cooking a stew,
Esau came in from the field, and he was famished. Esau said to Jacob, "Let me eat some of that red stuff, for I am famished."
Jacob said, "First, sell me your birthright."
Esau said, "I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me?"
Jacob said, "Swear to me first."
So he swore to him and sold his birthright to Jacob.
Then Jacob gave Esau bread and lentil stew.
And he ate and drank and rose and went his way. Thus Esau despised his birthright.
All right. Thank you, guys. Kind of gives us a different angle on the story a little bit when we do different things like that. Now, keep your Bibles open to Genesis chapter 25, beginning in verse 19, and we're going to kind of look at this together. By the time we get to verse 21, we read this: Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. Now, I know we kind of gave it away here, but when I was reading this and I was studying this, preparing the sermon, that caught me off guard. I didn't remember Rebekah being barren. Now, you remember Sarah being barren, right? You remember maybe Rachel being barren, who's Jacob's wife. But did you guys remember that Rebekah also was barren? And I was kind of stunned by this. Kind of felt like, well, gosh, I can't believe I didn't remember that. And that day, actually, I was preparing the sermon in the morning and went to lunch with another pastor in town. And I was having lunch with him, and I asked him the question, did you realize that Rebekah was barren? And he said, no, I didn't remember that. So I didn't feel so bad. And then I went to a denominational meeting and was doing a devotion with about 15 other pastors, and I did this. And after the devotion was over, several came up to me and confessed that they too didn't remember that Rebekah was barren. And I think we don't remember it because we just move over it so quickly, or the text moves over it so quickly here. But Isaac was how old? 40 when he married Rebekah, and now he is 60. Think about this for a minute, and let this land on you for just a minute. Do you realize there are 20 full years right here in this one verse when it seems like the promise of God is not going to be fulfilled? I mean, do you think there were times in these 20 years when Isaac wondered if Abraham found the right girl? Do you think there were times in these 20 years when Rebekah questioned whether or not she should have left her family and married Isaac? Were there times in these 20 years when Isaac had to go, was my dad just crazy or what? Because it seems to me like God's not going to fulfill this promise. And you know, you and I, many times we're in the middle, and we feel like God is leading in a particular direction, and we step in that direction, and there's a long period of time when it seems like God's not going to come through. We need to remember this verse. when you remember this text, when you remember this story. And here, kind of hidden in this one verse, is the reality that God doesn't always move as quickly as we want him to move, does he? He doesn't always move as fast as we want him to move. And here, in this one verse, we see that Isaac is praying for his wife, and it quickly says in the one verse, and God answered his prayer, and she gave birth to the twins. Now, as we look at this, I think we also have to look at this whole deal that Isaac prayed to his wife, or prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. You have to ask the question, don't you? Would Isaac have been praying to God if his wife would not have been barren? Would Isaac have prayed to the Lord if his house were full of children? So maybe in some ways God is allowing Isaac to live in dependence on him during this time. And many times when we're in that period of waiting, many times when we're not sure if God's going to come through, God's doing that because he wants us to live in dependence on him. And I think we see that here in the text. So very quickly, verse 21, the Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. Now, we're told that there's something not quite right going on with her pregnancy. Look at verse 22. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. Now, Rebekah had not been pregnant before. She didn't know what this whole deal was like. And here she's got these babies somehow jostling within her, probably in a pretty significant sort of way. I mean, you can imagine her going over to her friend's house. Is this supposed to happen? Did they move this much, right? Because evidently they're jostling in a way that's, not just keeping her up at night, but maybe even is pretty painful. So finally she goes to God, and she says, "God, what's going on here? This isn't normal. Why is there so much commotion inside of me?" And God lets her know. Look what he says in verse 23. The Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb, and two peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger." So this prophecy here at the very beginning, all the way back when she is pregnant here. Now, what you may not know in our culture is that in Middle Eastern culture, being the oldest child is a big deal. It's a big deal because you get it all if you're the oldest child. Now, in our culture, not a lot of emphasis on birth order, right? I mean, if somebody passes away, they usually leave all of their assets in equal amounts to their kids, right? That's usually what happens. But in Middle Eastern culture, it wasn't that way. In Middle Eastern culture, the oldest gets it all, and the youngest gets nothing. The oldest inherits the family name, the family land, all the assets of the family, and becomes the leader of the family, and the younger serves the older. That's how it works out in Middle Eastern culture, but it's flipped around here. And God tells Rebekah, the older will serve the younger. It'll be different. It'll be flipped upside down with your kids. You wonder if Rebekah kind of kept this in the back of her mind as the boys were growing up. You think she remembered this? I'm sure she did, right? Maybe the boys are out playing in the yard and getting in a little scuffle, and then Rebekah remembers what God told her. This is more than just sibling rivalry here. Something significant is going to happen with these boys. The time comes for the twins to be born. Look at verse 24. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twin boys in her womb. The first to come out was red, and his whole body was like a hairy garment. Now, you've seen red newborns, right? But have you ever seen newborns with so much hair they look like a hairy garment? That's just kind of weird, isn't it? So they named him Esau. After this, his brother came out with his hand grasping Esau's heel. So he was named Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when Rebekah gave birth to them. So a little strange here, some details. We've got this red, hairy newborn. And the second thing is that the younger, Jacob, is actually grabbing the heel of his brother as he is coming out. They remember these details. It's almost as if Jacob is trying to pull Esau back in so that he can get out first. And then we're told here that Isaac's 60 years old. Again, it gives us a clue. We understand there's a whole 20-year gap here between when Rebekah and Isaac marry and God fulfills the promise by giving them the sons. So we read in verse 27, the boys grew up. Esau became a skillful hunter, a man of the open country, while Jacob was a quiet man, staying among the tents. Isaac, who had a taste for wild game, loved Esau, but Rebekah loved Jacob. So the boys are different in terms of their interests and hobbies. Esau likes to hunt. He seems to be a man's man. Remember, he's the hairy one, right? He's the one who drives four-wheel drives and lifts weights and plays football and collects guns. That's Jacob. I mean, that's Esau. Jacob, on the other hand, is a quiet man. He likes to stay around the tents. In other words, he hangs out with the women. He does the cooking. You know, that's the kind of person he is. I kind of picture Esau as being on the cover of Field and Stream magazine while Jacob is on the cover of GQ. That's how I picture the two. We're told that Isaac likes Esau, right? He's a man's man. He hunts. He does all that kind of stuff. And Rebekah prefers Jacob. No question that they have favorites here. And this is what really sets the scene for what happens next. Okay, we spent about 2/3 of the sermon kind of leading up to the story. And this is, I think, the heart of the story this morning. It's a pivot point in their relationship. Now, these boys are different personalities. You can imagine they had squabbles at times. You can imagine there was tension at times. But it all comes to a head in this story this morning. Verse 29. Once when Jacob was cooking some stew, Esau came in from the open country, famished. He said to Jacob, "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." That is why he was also called Edom. Isn't it ironic that he's red and he wants red stew? I mean, you kind of see the connection there. But here's the deal. Esau's been out hunting and he's hungry. He's famished. He forgot to take his granola bars with him or whatever. He comes back in and Jacob has prepared this meal. And it's evidently a pretty delicious looking meal. It's a red stew. Have you ever been really hungry and you come in and you see something cooking and smelling good? Maybe he's got some fresh baked bread alongside, you know, and he's famished. Now, he's kind of gruff here, you have to admit. He says, "Give me some of that stew." Even the language there just sounds gruff. It kind of reflects, I think, Esau's personality. And Jacob's response in verse 31, Jacob replied, "First, sell me your birthright." Now, that's pretty crazy, isn't it? I would guess that they've had this discussion with the birthright before. You think? I mean, they're twins. I mean, Esau only beat him out by a few minutes, right? But he gets it all. And there must have been some bitterness here. And Jacob could have thought, you know, if I'd have been turned a little differently, or my mom would have been turned a little differently, maybe I would have came out first. Maybe I would have everything. And Jacob wants Esau's birthright. Sell me your birthright, and I'll give you some stew. Now, that doesn't seem like an even trade to me. Most of you are going, that doesn't make any sense. The family name, the family land, all the family assets, or a bowl of stew. Which one are you going to choose? No doubt, Jacob may be taking advantage of Esau's hunger, do you think? Esau responds in an almost sarcastic tone in verse 32. "Look, I'm about to die," he said. "What good is the birthright to me?" But Jacob's not playing around. He's not joking here. He says, "No, Esau, I'm serious here. A bowl of stew for the birthright. I want you to make an oath. I want you to swear to me. I want you to sign this piece of paper right here." Look at verse 33. So he swore an oath to him, selling his birthright to Jacob. The language there is of a contract, of an oath. And in the Middle East, an oath is a big deal. It's more than just saying, yeah, I'll take your birthright. You can have my birthright. Give me the stew. I mean, it's a contract here. He signs the paperwork. He makes it official. He sells his birthright for a bowl of stew. Verse 34, then Jacob gave Esau some bread and some lentil stew. He ate and drank, and then he got up and left. Now, have you ever been like really hungry and you think, I'm just going to die if I don't have something to eat? But how long does it take before that feeling goes away? Just a few minutes, right? One meal. In one meal, one plate of food about this big, you can be absolutely stuffed. And that's what happened here. Esau huffs it down, and he gets up, and he realizes, you know what? That was a bad deal. You know what? I just sold my birthright. The author of Genesis simply says in verse 34, so Esau despised his birthright. He despised his birthright. Now, what does that mean? And I think this is kind of like the key verse in the story. If you underline anything, underline that verse. Esau despised his birthright. Certainly, Esau and Jacob must have known the promise, you think? And while it apparently Abraham is gone before they come around, they must have known the story of their grandfather Abraham. They must have known that he left his land and he went in faith to a place where he didn't know how God was going to work it all out, with a wife who was old, who couldn't have children, and God came through and God promised. And you remember the story when when the servant was finding a wife for Isaac? He asked Abraham, look, if I can't get the girl to come back here, how about I just take Isaac back to the homeland and you just kind of start over there? And Abraham was adamant. He said, no, don't take him back, because Abraham was centered on God's promise, on God's leading. He knew that God was going to fulfill this promise through him. Abraham's whole life was about this promise. And now Rebekah has joined Isaac, and they are fulfilling this promise, and God is fulfilling this promise through them. It's a pretty big deal for them. And here, the next in line, Esau sells it for a bowl of stew. Do you see where the story's going? And I think this is what the author of Genesis means when he says Esau despised his birthright. Because all that God had been doing, all that God was accomplishing through them, and ultimately we know where the promise ends up, don't we? The promise ends up with Jesus. With God blessing all nations through this family line. God is going one direction. He's moving one direction. He's calling these people to participate with him in this direction. And Esau sells it all for a bowl of stew. He despised his birthright. He didn't realize how valuable it was. He didn't care very much. Look how the author of Hebrews speaks of this situation. In fact, he's talking about sexual immorality here. And he says, see to it that no one is sexually immoral or is godless like Esau, who for a single meal sold his inheritance rights as the eldest son. Do you see that? When the author of Hebrews reflects back on this story, he sees Esau's actions as immoral, as sinful. Isn't that interesting? So when the author of Genesis tells us Esau despised his birthright, that's what he's getting at there. He basically slapped God in the face and said, you know, what all that you're doing, God, it's really not that important, because all I care about is getting my stomach filled. And I think if we're going to apply this to you and me in 2012, and we're going to ask, what do we do with this story? How does it apply to us? How does it impact my life? What does it mean for me today? I think this is the point here. The point is, are we going to be children of the promise, as we sang? Are we going to follow God into the unknown? Are we going to live lives of faith that are dependent on God moving and us saying, God, we're going to join you wherever you're going? Or are we going to be like Esau and simply be concerned with getting our stomachs filled? Meeting our own needs. Kind of interested in ourselves. And you know, we fight this in American culture today, don't we? Because we're told it's all about you. It's all about getting your needs met. And even many churches have kind of gone this direction, you know. It's all about meeting needs. It's about filling stomachs. It's about helping people get what they want out of life. And here in the text we're seeing it's a contrast between that kind of vision and the kind of vision that says, I'm going to go where God wants me to go, regardless of what it costs me. I'm going to go where God wants me to go, whether I get my needs met or not. I'm going to be faithful. I'm going to obey. I'm going to step into places where it's uncomfortable, where it doesn't look like it's, maybe even at times it looks like God's not even going to come through. And this picture, this contrast of following God's promise or filling our own stomachs. That's the two things I think that we see here in the text. What are we going to do? Individually, what are you going to do? What are we going to do? Maybe we're going to say, God, I'm going to go with you, wherever it is. I'm going to be obedient to your calling in my life. As a church, collectively, what are we going to do? Are we going to be faithful? Are we going to step into the unknown, going where God has called us to go? Or are we going to simply be like Esau, to be willing to trade it all just so our needs would be met? We're going to invite you to stand now and respond in whatever way you want to respond this morning. I'm not sure what God's saying to you this morning. And maybe your life is simply focused on your own needs, on your stomach being filled. And maybe this morning God is calling out to you. He's asking you to drop your own needs and to follow Him. That's the first step. That's what it means to follow Christ, to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and to follow Him wherever He might lead us. Maybe you've never done that before, and you would want to do that this morning. I'll be standing down front. Maybe you'd want to pray this morning. God would be speaking to you into some way that you need to come and to bow down. You come and do that now as we sing. As we have gathered together this morning as the people of God, we've been challenged with this story, the story from of old. We've been challenged with the question whether or not we're going to participate in God's promise, or are we going to despise the birthright? Go now in peace. Amen.